The recent war in the Middle East has become the focus of the world. Actually, I'm the type who really wants to know what's happening right now, but I just can't stand that image. I don't have the heart to watch, and I don't want to talk about war at all, so I plan to make 2 videos separately discussing the experiences of Israel and Palestine. Actually, Palestine, it can hardly be called an economy because it lacks many basic economic frameworks. Over the past decades, it has indeed been heavily oppressed by Israel. We'll talk about it next time. As for Israel, from an economic perspective, it is indeed a unique presence. So I hope everyone can put aside their subjective views on Israel or Jews in this video. Let's take a look at Israel's economy together. The Israel-Palestine region can be said to be the most chaotic in the world. You might think Israel is like this, but actually Israel is like this. Its per capita GDP is as high as $55,000. If you look at its neighbors, like Turkey, Iraq, it's not even on the same scale. Even the wealthy Saudi Arabia is overwhelmed by it, surpassing even the UK, Germany, and Japan, and challenging the United States. It can achieve such a steep curve compared to a very special historical background. So I personally find it interesting. So what has Israel's economy really gone through? First, let's quickly overview the historical background of Israel. Now, this entire region of Israel and Palestine is called the Palestinian region, which was ruled by Jews over 2,000 years ago. After going through various dynasties, this region was called by the British after the First World War in the later 2000 years. At that time, Arabs, making up 3/4 of the total population, primarily resided in this place, while Jews accounted for about 13%. At that time, the Jewish Stat had a wave of resumption of work. He wants to establish his own democracy on this land. In addition to the Holocaust in Europe and various political reasons, Jews from all over the world flocked to Palestine. In more than 20 years, the population has increased 8-fold. At the end of World War II, the Jewish population had reached 600,000, accounting for 1/3 of the local population. Considering the rapid influx of so many Jews, the Arabs who originally lived there must be unhappy, leading to escalating violence between the two sides. After World War II, the British could no longer manage and directly handed this mess over to the newly established United Nations. The United Nations had a good idea, saying that since you Jews and Arabs are fighting all the time, why not divide you into 2 countries, each with its own territory? The United Nations passed Resolution 181. How to divide it? We just divide it like this. Looking at this division, it seems like a puzzle, doesn't it? Jews must be very happy with this division plan. Because firstly, the international community has recognized that you can establish a country, and they gave you such a large piece of land, so they gladly accepted the plan and announced it in 1948, established independently in place. But you should know that the Arabs here are firmly opposed. All around Israel are Arab countries. Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and other Arab countries began to attack Israel the day after its establishment. The Fourth Middle East War has been launched. Surprisingly, the Israelis are really capable of fighting, not to mention the covert support from Jews internationally, including the United States. Both sides retreated in 1949. Israel, on the other hand, controlled the area that looked like a jigsaw puzzle drawn by the United Nations. There are about 700,000 Arabs on the mountain who were forced to flee. The Arabs also called this exodus a great disaster. This war also ignited the ongoing disputes between Israel and the surrounding Arab countries. Let's take a look at Israel's economy at this time. It had just undergone the Holocaust and World War II, followed by the First Middle East conflict, so it's safe to say that the last thing it lacks is enemies. What economic card does he hold at this time? Don't underestimate Israel's natural resources. They're not far from oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia and Iraq. But its natural resources are very scarce. It has always been an importer of fossil fuels. It wasn't until around 2010 that some natural gas was discovered and the situation improved. Water resources are also very scarce. In short, the economy of Israel was on the verge of collapse. It was a very, very difficult post-war reconstruction. So everyone's goal was actually just to survive. But in fact, Israel still holds 2 trump cards that I deliberately didn't mention earlier. These can be said to be the 2 economic cards that have changed its national fortune, the 2 gold cards. Back then, the United States provided Israel with the most basic material supplies, unlike the vigorous aid the US gave to South Korea at that time. What are these 2 gold cards? The first chapter is about war reparations. War reparations from the Germans. In 1952, Hedda signed a compensation agreement with Israel, stating that Hedda would pay Israel 3 billion marks in the next 14 years. This is equivalent to more than 1/4 of Israel's GDP in those years. Note that it's not 1/4 of government revenue, but 1/4 of the national GDP. Although Israel's GDP was relatively low at that time, it highlighted the importance of this compensation. Israel could use this money to buy supplies, technologies, production materials, and so on in the international market. His second gold card is a new immigrant. Every year, 30,000 to 70,000 Jews come to Israel. They don't come empty-handed, they bring all their belongings and assets to Israel. This portion of property is estimated to be on the same scale as Germany's reparations. These 2 gold cards mean that Israel no longer needs funds from the electrical fire. With an annual GDP growth rate exceeding 10%, it has also developed some decent industries. For example, the textile industry has become its pillar industry and also the second largest export industry. Do you know what their largest export industry is? Let me tell you, it is a globally leading industry developed by Israel over the years. I guess you didn't guess it even for 100 times. It's diamond polishing. Now, there are 3 major diamond manufacturing centers in the world: Gili Stone, India, and Israel. This is a small knowledge point, and just when everything is going smoothly, Israel feels like making money from it.
And the concealment
when
of war.
you come out, bam, a blow to the head. In October 1973, Israel, Egypt, Syria, and the Arab countries behind them broke out in war again. This war could be described as the most intense and largest scale conflict between the two sides in history, which eventually turned into a confrontation between the United States and the former Soviet Union. This is the Fourth Middle East War, also known as the Yom Kippur War. Why is this war important? Why do I want to talk about it separately? It's not just because it's big in scale, but because of the impact it had afterward. You'd think all the Middle East is Arab countries, all oil tycoons. Very upset, the United States openly supports Israel's actions. So it leads OPEC against Israel, the United States, the United Kingdom, and mobilizes its troops. An oil embargo that lasted for a year was implemented, during which global oil prices tripled, triggering the world's first oil embargo. Following the Iranian Revolution 6 years later, sparked the Second World War. Global inflation has become very severe, with countries like the United States and the United Kingdom experiencing the worst inflation in decades, reaching around 10%. On Israel's side, it was first short of oil, and all Arab countries carried out oil embargoes on it, which put even greater inflationary pressure on them.
Good.
Plus, they spent so much money on the war. Where did the money come from? Right, they could only borrow. So its inflation reached 450% in 1984. That is, the prices quadruple every year, almost like Venezuela now. Rampant inflation is definitely destructive for the economy. So the decade after redemption and war is also known as Israel's lost decade. The smarter guys might have noticed that it's called the lost decade, not 2 or 3 decades. Why? Because after the 80s, Israel was not lost anymore. This has to do with a very key figure in Israel. This person can be said to be a very legendary figure in Israeli politics. He may not be the most glamorous one, but he can be said to be one of the ones who did the most work. He was born in 1923 and has been active in Israeli politics his entire life, bouncing between key positions such as the Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Finance, and so on. He is more famous for his diplomatic abilities, having successfully persuaded the United States and France to sell him a large amount of military equipment. His repeated terms of office began with the lost decade in Israel. Whenever there is a little problem and someone needs to make a scene, they ask, Hiles, please. In 84, inflation was already so high, if not managed, everyone might be heading straight for 1,000%. Thus, Peres, as the fire chief, became the president of Israel. After he took office, he immediately embarked on a series of very firm economic policies. First of all, he strictly controlled government expenditure and limited government borrowing. Secondly, he made the Israeli central bank completely independent. Of course, there was a central bank in Israel before, but it was somewhat dependent. After this reform by Peres, the central bank became independent, right? So you don't have to worry about the government, you just have one goal, which is to control inflation. These are the 2 things that limit government spending. Completely independent and familiar. Those who know our channel should know that these are very smart and effective ways to control inflation. But if you ask where Peres is great, that's where it's hard. The difficulty lies in someone daring to propose and being able to implement it. You just say you want the government to reduce spending. Then who do you cut? Who do you give your savings to? So these 2 things, though the Venetian economy is certainly good, the government will face tremendous pressure in the short term.
That's also why this
in an
is the
emergency.
case.
We need
Please
this old guy
guide
Peres
me.
to show up, and the old man is
Although
really
the
decisive.
government has
The Israeli
started-
government's expenditure was directly cut after 1984, a significant reduction from the budget of 1983.
Wow, tofu.
The debt started to go downhill from then on. Look, we've watched so many shows
many
about crows.
goes.
It's rare to see that after the 90s, government spending is getting less and less, and the money borrowed is less and less. Here at the central bank, it's just a fight, wiped out 100% to combat inflation. Apart from these 2 moves, Peres has also convinced the union. It will jointly control prices, limit wages, and even devalue locally to increase market competitiveness. With this combination of punches, Israel's severe inflation was reduced to less than 20% in just 2 years, which is quite remarkable. It also laid a very important foundation for the development of similar weapons in the future. Peres later also facilitated the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan in 1993, as well as the historic Oslo Agreement between Israel and Palestine. Although peace did not last long, his contribution to Israel is still very large. In 2007, the 84-year-old Peres was elected the 9th president of Israel. The last person of the founding generation of Israel has finally ended his nearly 70-year political career. Okay, let's talk about the Israeli economy in the 80s. He just suppressed inflation, right? That's definitely impressive. But stability doesn't equate to development, right? The curve we just saw doesn't mean that the central bank's independence and the government's spending can achieve this. First of all, what Israel is doing is also what the world was doing in the 80s, which is privatization, marketization, and market economy. While privatization will certainly release a lot of capacity, which is very common, but this is not enough for Israel. If you only rely on free competition, you might not be able to compete with other countries. You must have your own characteristics and secret weapons. The path chosen by Israel is innovation.
God placed us in a neighborhood surrounded by enemies. Due to this, the people of Israel had to be creative. We had no choice.